Hello and welcome to Legally Consumed, a consumer products podcast by a consumer products law firm in Australia. I'm Raf Goldenberg and I'm joined by co-hosts Kay Ho and Will McMinn, who are members of the team at CIE Legal.
We chat with executives of consumer products companies, their legal teams and industry experts who give us a peek into their journeys as people. We explore industry-changing ideas and even share tips and tricks on how to navigate the consumer products space.
This season, we will feature guests from the automotive, retail, advertising and insights, food, beverage, and primary production and franchising sectors.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Legally Consumed podcast. My name's Raf Goldenberg and I'm hosting the podcast today with Will McMinn. Today we are joined by two guests, which is a first for us. We've always had one guest, but these two guests are so special we thought we'd bring them together. We have Allan Briggs, who's the CEO of Crisis Shield, a crisis management firm, and we also have Robert Hadler with us. And Robert is the director of an organisation called Origin, also sits on a number of boards and has a long history in comms for corporate organisations and others. Today's focus is going to be on crisis management and cybersecurity. But firstly, I'd like to welcome our guests. Welcome, Allan.
Thanks, Ray.
Great to have you here, and welcome, Robert.
Thank you very much.
So we like to start our podcast with a little bit of a get-to-know-you session. And we ask the same questions of our guests. So, Allan, I'll start with you. What was your first job? I'll start with that question.
Raf, my first job was actually as a surveyor. So, harking back to the days when I was down in the coal mines doing surveying and did my surveying degree and spent nearly 5 years doing that. And as a young man, I was pretty keen to find something a bit more exciting. And launched into the police force. So I spent the next 16 years in the police force.
Okay. And so what sort of stuff did you do in the police force?
Well, that sort of is a bit of a segue into how I came to where I am now. But spent 16 years there, 7 operational, and the last 9 years in their media and their public relations unit. And I think that's where I got the awakening or the saw the light that communications is so powerful and so beautiful in the sense if you craft a good message, can have a lot of impact for good and for bad. But in the police force, it was for good. So that's where I sort of learned how to going out to incidents and seeing whether it was a fire or a lost person or a homicide. If someone was well organised with the communications, they seemed to sail through it reasonably unscathed. As opposed to people who had no preparation, it had a massive impact.
So were you sort of the person who you'd see on the news who were coming live from Footscray and there's been reporting live, there's been an explosion at a building and...
Yeah, correct. So I did a lot of what we call piece to camera. So I would go out and represent the police force or I would organise the what we call the talking head. So it might have been a detective or an investigator. So, yeah, spent a number of years doing that and loved it. It was very exciting work. And then the last 4 years in emergency services, I actually worked for the Victorian State Emergency Service around their media, public relations, communication. So more guiding the volunteers and preparing them to talk because they were quite often out on scene and media would turn up. But, yeah, quite exciting times. There was everything from fires, floods. We had a volunteer drown during training. So that unfortunately got a lot of media attention, but Black Saturday, searches. So, yeah, I look back, it was a very exciting times and communication was just front and centre through the whole thing. So
were you at the SES during the Black Saturday?
Correct.
Yeah,
I worked 43 days straight. And again, I think now with the business, the learnings I've got, I always say about a lot of things that I did wrong back in those days in police and because we weren't really trained, sometimes just went out and winged it. So never worked 43 days straight because by the end of it, I was probably pretty inefficient and ineffective.
Yeah. And so how did you end up sort of moving into crisis management, and how did that all evolve?
Yeah, back in 2010, I started the business, and interesting, a lot of friends said, you're like the crisis guy. If something goes wrong, we'd call you. Yep. So I sort of got that brand up, and now actually branded that. So Google the crisis guy. You'll always find me on Wikipedia. So I trademarked that. And I just found with the business going in and working with big corporates, and interesting, back in 2010, I'd knock on the door and say, look, I think you should prepare for a crisis. People go, look, Alan, nothing will go wrong. Just leave your card. We moved 13 years forward, and people were knocking on my door going, we know something's going to go wrong. Can you help? Yeah, even before it's happened, we know bad things do happen. So, that's where the business sort of came to fruition. So, it's been terrific working predominantly with corporates. I find they're far better to work with in a sense. They say, look, there's a job to be done. Give us a quote. Come in, do the job. So I actually enjoy that. They're very
great. And we are a consumer products podcast. So when you got your first paycheck, assuming you didn't put it straight into the bank, what did you spend it on?
Well, actually, you mentioned that. I thought, wow, what did I do? I actually paid board. I don't know if kids do that now. I had to pay board.
Yeah, there you go. That's Robert's pointing the same thing.
We're showing our age here, aren't we, Robert? I had to pay board, which took a reasonable chunk out of it, but I think that was a good thing for discipline and paying for your way. And the rest of actually, I think I took a bit out to go to the pub, but the rest I put in because I was saving for a car. So that was, that was a big thing back then. So I was saving for a car. So I was pretty disciplined with my first paycheck.
What kind of a car were you saving for?
I bought a Hilux Ute.
Oh, timeless.
Well, the reason I bought a Hilux Ute is my parents said, we'll contribute if you buy a car where you can't hold a lot of people in it. So I got a 2-seater Hilux Ute. But back in those days, you could put all your mates in the back of the units, right? So I don't know which was the safer, having a 4-seater or 5-seater car or a Ute, but that was the...
Three did that. Yeah, that was that three did that. Thanks, Alan. I'm now going to turn to you, Robert. Tell us a bit about your first job and your career and your professional life.
Yeah, look, happy to chat about that. Look, my career spans broadly 3 eras. The first era, I graduated from Monash Uni, did an economics degree, looked around for a job, found that was in Canberra. So I packed up everything in my Holden station wagon, HR, and drove up the Hume Highway to Canberra with everything I owned in the back of the station wagon for the job as a policy advisor in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. So that was my first job, and for the next 5 years I worked in the public service in Canberra on policy advice. I worked for a politician and I worked in lobbying. And then I graduated from that into industry lobbying and from there into the corporate sector. And that's where I really found an interest in crisis management.
Yeah.
As was said before, corporates have got deeper pockets and they're able to fund preparatory work that you need to do that's essential in preparing for crisis. And they take it seriously, generally. So I really got into that, and I spent 20 years in that environment in a range of fast-moving consumer good industries, retail companies and banks.
Yeah. And so what sort of roles were you in?
Head of corporate affairs, investor relations roles.
Yeah.
So I had a stakeholder lens that really said that the customer comes first always.
Yep.
So whenever there was a crisis, we'd always think first up, what was the impact for the consumer, the customer, who was often a staff member, often a shareholder.
Mm.
So that drove our thinking of how we would communicate about a crisis.
Yep.
And then as I got older, I had to semi-retire.
Yep.
And I moved into the world of consulting, advising companies on crisis management, and also into the world of a non-executive director on various boards.
Yeah.
So that's been my career.
Yeah.
It's really been an inevitable progression over time of different experiences, but age as well, taking its toll.
And tell us a little bit about Origin.
Well, Origin Youth Mental Health is one of the world's leading think tanks on the exploding youth mental health crisis, not only in Australia but globally.
Okay.
It's based at Parkville in Melbourne, and they do a lot of world-leading research on the causes and treatments of youth mental health. One of the key issues is if you can actually get mental health problems early, you stop it from becoming a bigger issue, and you head off the costs of mental health down the track. So they focus a lot on that. They actually do clinical work for young people through Headspace centres.
Oh, that's Headspace. Okay.
Separate organisation, but they're aligned. And they do a lot of work in that area.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to have to tell my wife I mean, she's a psychiatrist, so she'd know it well. She'd know it well. And moving, I'm going to ask you the same question.
Yep.
Your first paycheck, did you use it on a consumer product, or did you do something else with it?
I paid the rent, mate.
Paid the rent. Paid the rent. Oh, gosh, how boring. Can someone go out and splurge and buy something really exciting? Fair enough. I was hoping for something, look, I went out and I,
There wasn't much left. I think I had a beer and a Palmer.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
All good things to spend on, I think. Yeah. So thanks for the intro, Raf. Allan, we might move to you, back to you. Obviously, we're focusing on cybersecurity and consumer products organizations, and a lot of consumer product organizations hold a lot of customer data. And you help companies manage all different types of crises. What's the sort of range of what Crisis Shield does and the crises that you manage?
We actually cover all crises. We're not specific to any particular crisis. And while we actually now work with clients, we have that team prepared for anything. So no matter what befalls the organisation, whether it's a cyber attack, a employee death, it's a fire, it's a pandemic, it doesn't matter. That team are actually formed to actually respond to whatever comes through the door, so to speak. So that's our mantra in the way we operate. Now, within a lot of companies, for example, in universities, they actually have a really strong program around dealing with students who've got mental health problems, or some even have what they call a sudden death response team. So if they have that situation, we call critical incident team, would gather, but they would call in that sudden death response team as a SME, subject matter expert, to help. If you had a cyber incident, you usually would bring in like your IT team, and we quite often have what we call a cyber playbook, like a guide. So the core team, as I said, are always ready for any type of situation. And then depending on what it is, there might be some guides or some teams who will come in and support them to work through that.
And can you tell the listeners maybe what the 3 most common crises are that you're engaged in?
Look, at the moment, the cyber is number one.
Yep.
Absolutely. And it's frightening. And we've just had a presentation today. I presented at a conference yesterday. I was on a webinar 2 weeks ago and 2 weeks before that. And I'm just constantly banging on about this because this frightens me. It really does. I look at pre-pandemic, we did a lot of work around active shooter. So terrorism was a real threat, particularly here in Melbourne, but globally it was a threat. And we have an office in London. It was a threat over there. So everyone's focus, ours included, was very much on an active shooter or terrorism. Now that's quelled quite a bit, which is a great thing. The lone wolf is still a concern, but that is a very relatively low risk. We then had the pandemic. Now coming to that, we've now got cyber. Now historically, we used to train our clients for all type of crises, whether it's a pandemic, an active shooter, a cyber event. What's moved forward is cyber is now, this is so real, and I keep banging on about it, is that it's going to happen to every business. And I've got no doubt about that. We don't have to say, look, we should look at that, we'll think about it. We must do it. So for us, the highest threat is cyber. Probably the second one is people just doing stupid things, unfortunately.
Right.
And we've seen, if we look around over the last few years, major incidents for some companies. And interesting, we often talk about companies will say, we'll put the CEO up in charge. We don't do that for good reason, because quite often the CEO could be the one that's been kidnapped, could be the one that's the perpetrator, the one that's actually in jail. So people doing stupid things or illegal things. And then I sort of drop it down into your more like, for example, global warming, environmental impacts, the war in Ukraine, those type of things. So it's sometimes outside our control, but having a big impact on our business.
Yeah, right. Fascinating.
Mm.
And Rob, you said before you've had a history in corporate affairs, and it was always, what impact does this have on the customer? That was the first thought. But what was the first action What did you do first if you were confronted with a crisis?
Well, the first thing is always to prepare for a crisis, not think that it's not going to happen or stick your head in the sand and hope it goes away. So what do I mean by preparation? Well, in the corporate world, everyone thinks of writing a 60-page crisis manual about what you do, and there's draft announcements and there's a whole raft of processes and plans.
And then everybody has to read all 60 pages.
The reality is it sits on the shelf and gathers dust and no one looks at it. But the best thing that ever comes out of a crisis management plan is that you identify who's going to be on the crisis management committee, and you allocate roles and responsibilities. You allocate a place for them to meet. You allocate dedicated facilities for them to use, whether it's telecommunications, which need to be secure in the event of a cyber attack, or even photocopiers and faxes as old technology as a fallback, and other things that need to be done. Once you've got that in place, you're well positioned to manage that first hour of a crisis, whatever the crisis is, whenever it occurs, because you need someone to run the business, as we talked about before, but you need a dedicated crisis management team to actually run the crisis response and the business continuity plan. And, the last major job I had was at Coles. Our mantra there was the customer comes first always. So whether it was a fire, the bushfires up in Victoria in 19, floods up in Queensland and New South Wales, or the pandemic, our focus was always how can we help the business meet our customer requirements. So that's the first and most important thing in managing the crisis.
Right. The classic who, what, when, where, sort of, if you know those steps, you can manage the rest.
Exactly right.
Yeah, fascinating.
I mean, I'm interested in, like Coles to me does seem like I'm a customer of Coles. I think probably most Australians are. But you actually feel that customer-focused approach. They seem to be very thoughtful and deliberate about, when something happens, whether a pandemic's a great example, like how quickly they got, I don't know, all that click and collect stuff and the deliveries, but also what they needed to do in their stores and how that changed. Like, do you have any insights as to, from an organisational perspective, is that what you experienced in your time there?
The new management team at Coles came into place in 2009.
Yeah.
And they set about establishing a vision for the company. And the vision was to be a supermarket that consumers trusted.
Mm-hmm.
And that raised the bar enormously for everyone who worked in the company, and it set their vision about what we had to do. So whether in the floods, the fires, in the pandemic, it was all about what we needed to do to make sure customers got what they needed. It dominates thinking, but it's a huge logistical exercise. I mean, Coles has 2,500 stores across the country and 102,000 employees. You can imagine the logistics of daily fresh delivery into all those stores. So having your crisis management team and your business continuity plan in lockstep is mainly about logistics.
Yeah.
It becomes a little different in the world of a cyber event, whether you're losing customer data, whether you're losing financial data. It's less tangible, but it's extremely important to the consumer whose data has been taken, whether it's through flybys or some other database. So rest assured, Coles executives, the first thing they would think about is how can they protect the consumer and their customer.
Very interesting and reassuring. Allan, from your perspective, what are some of the trends you're noticing in terms of cyber crisis management? You spoke at an event for us just before this, and I've got to say it was the most well-attended lunch we've had because, I think we thought there might be planned for 15 or 20, send invites to 30, and everyone said yes. So what are you noticing at the moment?
Well, Raf, we're noticing that, gratefully, that people are now treating this seriously. And I think the reality of that is that Optus and Medibank and even Latitude and others have just demonstrated that these big corporates, who one would have thought would just handle it, with great ease, struggled. And not only did they struggle, it also had a massive impact on their brand, on their business turnover. So that is now forced, mainly at large corporates particularly, to say, this is really serious. We've seen what happens when it goes wrong. We have to start investing in this. So we're seeing like 90% of our work is cyber related. If it's not doing a webinar or running a simulation, cyber playbooks, people are bringing us in and saying, look, this is really keeping us awake at night, and for good reason. So cyber has absolutely become, the lead. Like I said, a few years ago, it was terrorism. That was what was keeping everyone awake at night. Then we had the pandemic coming out the other side. And the reality is, I think the potential of cyber is actually more on a business than a pandemic or a terrorism event.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned Optus and Medibank. Rob, can you cast your thoughts on how those organisations managed their response to their cyber crisis?
Oh, look, Raph, it's easy to be critical when you're standing outside an organisation.
Yeah.
When you actually work in an organisation in the middle of a crisis, you fully understand how difficult it is to manage all the competing needs of all the stakeholders you've got.
Yeah.
And often you're trying to do the best you can with incomplete information.
Yeah.
And as Allan said in the lunch seminar, it could be days or weeks or even months before you fully know what data's been lost, what data's been compromised, and what the situation is in a cyber incident.
Yeah.
So it's extremely difficult when you're inside an organisation, and easy to be an armchair commentator. So I'm loath to be the armchair commentator because I've been inside and been criticised.
Yeah.
Having said that, I think there are some important lessons and some golden rules.
Yeah.
And the important lessons out of both Optus and Latitude is to be as quick as possible in communicating to your customers who have been affected by a data leak about their data.
Mm.
Even if you don't know the full extent, they want to be assured that you're acting to find out, you're acting to retrieve the situation, and you're acting to prevent it ever happening again.
Mm.
So it's that reassurance that manages the shock and the anger that consumers feel when there's been a data breach. And that'll, if you do it well, it minimises the revenge that they want to take out on the company down the track. So that's the secret to it. If it's properly managed, you can probably get through a cyber incident in a week. If it's badly managed, you don't manage their expectations, you don't inform them properly, you don't comment at all, which leaves the door open for others to fill the vacuum in the media. They're usually your critics. It can go for months. The lesson of history is that a third of companies who go through a major crisis cease to exist. Their reputation is so badly damaged that they can't continue. A third of companies have to change their name and their business model, and it's only a third of the companies that muddle through and survive unaffected.
Yeah.
So, as Allan said, we need to treat this seriously.
And I guess if you are regularly communicating with your customers with those sort of messages about this is what we're looking at, this is what we're doing, this is how we're trying to fix it, it takes the pressure off the government from having to feel like they need to say something to satisfy the angry masses, because I reckon when there's a vacuum and the company is saying nothing, that's when the government feels like, oh, well, they need to be the one to pacify the people. But if you can do that, presumably it takes the heat off them and they don't feel like they have to step up. Is that right?
The simple message is that consumers are voters.
Yeah.
And politicians don't like problems, they want solutions.
Yeah, so if you can deliver it, if you can sort of take that off their hands, they'll probably step back a little bit more.
Correct. If they've got confidence in the way you're managing a cyber event, then they won't come over the top of it. They'll give you breathing space.
Yeah.
But if there's a vacuum, the media's criticising you, voters, i.e. consumers, and the media are calling for action, the government will step into the back end.
Yeah. And if you are managing it well, your audience will just keep coming back to you because they'll trust you and they'll follow you. They don't need a third party to cast comment. They'll come back to you because they trust you and you're managing it well.
Yeah, because they're humans. They know people make mistakes. It's about how you deal with them. So, Alan, I guess from just an overall crisis management, and I've got Robert's comments about not being the armchair critic ringing in my ears, but I guess some of the themes in terms of, and lessons, I guess, from just the way that those, not just the cons, but the overall, the issues were dealt with. Like, can you sort of, I don't know, some of the good lessons and some of the bad lessons?
Through the recent large cyber events.
So, yeah, through the recent ones in Australia.
Yeah, my take on it, my view is I don't think those companies just really foresaw the impact that was going to be. First, I don't think they thought they'd fall victim to it. And secondly, I just don't think they had any concept of just how bad it was going to be. And we do see it with some clients. To this day, there's still clients or people we interface with who believe it won't happen to them.
Well,
That is the first major problem. You have to walk around and think it's going to happen to me because then you'll start doing something about it. So I think that was probably their first point of failure, if you like, that came in. And because of that, they weren't prepared for it. So while those companies, I believe, would have managed a lot of other things, say, for example, a financial crisis, other things they're familiar with, I think they probably would have managed them extremely well. That they were totally unprepared for cyber. And that really caught them wanting or lacking. So that was another gap there. The other thing is that your stakeholders, and I think we've talked about this a lot, people will accept sometimes if you do something wrong. It's how you recover and how you manage that. And those companies we talked about, that was, in my view, where they really started to fall over, is that people said, well, we'll sort of accept you had a cyber attack. We're not happy about it, but we're really disappointed the way you're managing this. And that's where, what was bad turned into terrible.
Was there anything good? Were there any, did you see some good practices?
Yeah, I did. I think they had good intent. I think they went out there with the intent to do the good thing. I don't think there was any ill intent. So they had good intention. It's just that they hadn't experienced that, they hadn't prepared for it, and that left them wanting. So my view is that, that all, good companies had good intent that hadn't practiced that. I can see some of them are now doing a lot of work to do that recovery, and I think it's so important. They've realised, if like error of the ways, and they're now doing a lot of work to remediate and bring their stakeholders, their audience back on side.
Yeah, look, I think there are the 3 golden rules for me in communications about a crisis is always tell the truth. Sometimes people attempted to gloss over things or not tell all the truth. Always tell the truth because you'll get found to have to tell a lie, and that'll make it worse. The second golden rule is if you don't know all the facts, admit it and talk about the process steps that you're going through to deal with the problem, and reassure consumers that you're going to come out the other side.
Yeah.
And the third golden rule is to give customers reassurance that it won't happen again. You're going to make sure it's not going to happen again, and that you're going to fix up what damage has happened to them. So there, I think, the way you maintain consumer trust in a cyber crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we've seen there's a little bit of an evolving regulatory landscape. Obviously, there's a lot of departments. I was looking at this before we came on. There's a lot of departments that are in charge of investigating data breaches and cybersecurity. We've got Signals Directorate, we've got the Federal Police, we've got State Police. You've probably got your own internal risk and compliance teams. So there's obviously a lot of stakeholders involved. But in terms of recent developments, there's talk about banning the payment of ransoms in Australia if you're faced with a cyber attack. Alan, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, good question, Will. Firstly, going back to the regulatory side of it, the fact is the volume of cyber attacks that are happening now, those agencies can't keep up. They've publicly admitted that they can't handle the volume. So they're in a position they've got to pick the ones that are either of national security the ones that are, for example, what I call essential services. So that they're the critical ones. I'll focus on those, or if it's a significant sum of money. So most of those big corporates won't actually get unfortunately, much attention from them, not because they don't want to, just their capacity is not there to do it.
Hey.
So that's the first thing around that. The next one is that even when you go and report it into them, that's a long-term investigation. The reality is that's not going to, you don't ring them up and all of a sudden, they chopper in and rappel onto.
No SWAT teams coming in.
No SWAT team coming in to save the day. It could be months or years before you get any, if any, resolution. So I always say to my clients, work on the premise that we're going to have to deal with this ourselves through our own network, our own insurance, our own team. So work on that. That's a mission.
Assume help is not coming.
Yeah, exactly.
I'd go even further than that. I'd say fulfill your reporting requirements, but don't outsource your responsibility for managing the crisis to a regulatory agency. You've got to take control of the crisis because your customers or your consumers are yours. They're not the regulator's responsibility. They've got to cover their ass with politicians.
Yeah.
You've got to cover your responsibility with your customers, your staff and your shareholders. So you've got to take responsibility for it. And sometimes you've got to make the hard decisions and not to agree to what the regulator wants you to do. You might have to live with some consequences as a result of that. But at the end of the day, your business model depends on your customers.
Yeah. And to back up the question about paying a ransom, the government advice is not to pay, which it makes sense, and that is good advice. However, the government is making a decision when they're not running a business, and we've had this scenario where companies are running a business and they are willing to pay a ransom if they believe that will restore the business back to the position it was before the attack. So again, comes down to insurer about what position the business wants to take on that, depending what type of business, are you manufacturing, what sort of services, what data has been compromised. So there's not a very silver bullet, if you like, to that question. I think you need, again, I always say go back to doing some drills and scenario testing, and that'll flesh out what your position is going to be.
I think it's a good idea to workshop that threshold issue with your board of directors, with your senior executive team before a crisis happens. So you've got an in-principle position of how you're going to deal with it in different circumstances, whether it's a denial of service attack, whether it's a ransomware attack. So you've got some basic propositions going in to a crisis that you know how you're in principle going to deal with it. My only caveat to that is every crisis is different, and you've got to be prepared to get punched in the face and do things differently when a crisis occurs.
Yeah.
So you will get advice from regulators. You will get advice from your insurance company about what to do. But your board, your executive have got to make a balanced decision about what's best for your consumers. That's got to be the overriding driver of what you do. And if you're protecting their sensitive data, whether it's financial, health data, you might be open to paying a ransom. If the insurance company negotiators, who are quite skilled in this, can guarantee that if you negotiate, you will actually get the keys back, you'll get the data back, and they won't attack you again.
Yeah.
Can you ever trust that kind of an actor, someone who's already been in there and stolen your thing?
You can never trust that threat actor. Having said that, they're running a business, and if they don't honour giving you the keys back to your encrypted data, the next person won't, because that you'll broadcast that. The next person gets hacked won't pay a ransom. And we had one client who, interestingly, said the customer care from the cyber hacker team was the most loveliest person I've ever come across. They were so helpful because they wanted good customer service. They paid the ransom and they got all their data back. And they said they were lovely. Now they're criminals.
Send them a bottle of champagne.
Yeah. So this is the challenge, is that if and as Ron said, insurance companies do have negotiators. They have a good sense of if this is legitimate. They will reinstate your debt, or return the keys. So they'll pay the ransom, because usually the insurance company will also be up for that ransom as well.
It's not a black and white decision.
No.
It's quite complex. There are competing priorities, and you have to review it on a case-by-case basis. But ultimately, it's what's best for your consumers and your customers that counts.
Yeah. And I guess with these ransom situations, people often make this analogy with, you don't negotiate with terrorists because, once you do, they do it again, and they do it again, they do it again. And the reality is, if you're a victim of a cyber attack, they're unlikely to do it again against you, maybe.
I wouldn't say that necessarily.
Yeah, I just would have thought intuitively they would say, well, you're likely to tighten up over the next company down the road is a bit loose in terms of their cyber protections.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of organised have come back for more.
Okay. Oh, well, there goes that idea.
Yeah.
So, one thing I'm interested in, and sort of goes to Robert's comment about how unique each crisis event is. I'm interested in the value of simulations and test exercises. And, from someone, Allan, who's been involved both in running tests but real crises, can you talk a little bit about what value they are, how different it is? Like if you're the execs sitting in the room where it's a test versus the exec sitting in the room where it's real, what have you observed there in terms, because presumably, sorry, it's a long question, but presumably you've got some teams that you've done both with, right? That you've done the test and then you've seen them in the crisis.
Correct. So plans that are workable, not a 60-page document, but in fact, our plans now are basically step 1, 2, 3. So very clear. When you walk in, and the team actually they're that simple, if you like, that the team actually wants to know them without even referring to them. So that's the first thing. But I'm always a big believer in drills and simulations. And even if you think about your first aid, they'll go and say, well, there's some lying on the ground, go up and do your DRAVC. No different for your executive team. They should be doing it at a minimum annual drills or exercise scenarios on different types of events. And right now we are, but corporate should all be doing at least one cyber, because that will flush out how good is the team, how good are the plans, how good are our processes, because and everyone we run in a simulation, I'll put it this way, there's a lot of learnings. And the comment at the end of the debrief is, thank goodness that was a simulation and that wasn't a real event. And I'll give you some of the things we talked about earlier is that would you pay the ransom? What does the insurance policy cover? Would we talk to the media? What are our regulatory obligations? What are our moral obligations? Do we disconnect from the World Wide Web? IT team aren't going to make those decisions, the executive team. And if you haven't drilled that and had that discussion, how do we brief the board? What role does the board play? If we haven't run that through and pressure tested it,
it's all new, isn't it?
Yeah. Good luck on the day when it happens, because not only have you got a team in the boardroom trying to respond, you're still trying to run your normal business.
Yeah.
And the ones who've gone where they haven't rehearsed, it's not pretty.
Yeah.
Put it that way. Yeah.
You look like you were going to jump in a little earlier, Rob.
Oh, look, I was just going to reinforce the point that Allan's already made, that every crisis is different, but the steps for managing it are the same, whatever the crisis is.
Sure.
So when you've prepared for it and you've done a simulation, you will always unearth little gaps in your paper, in your plans, or in your processes. So in cyber, for instance, you might identify that your biggest weakness was in people who didn't have their passwords correctly authenticated. It might be that your plan missed an important step. Remember your processes. So an example of that, your internal IT might be fantastic and firewalls are very good, but what have you outsourced? Do you do admin in Manila? Do you do your customer call centre somewhere else overseas?
Probably.
Is it all cloud-based by a third-party supplier? You've got to look at all the exposures you've got on cyber through all of these external companies And are their cyber protection systems as good as yours?
Yep.
Those simulations actually help you identify gaps in the system where cyber criminals and, unfortunately, state actors are increasingly looking to exploit. And Allan talked before about some of the emerging threats in cyber attack. I'll hand back to Allan to talk more about where that's the next phase of the cyber criminal activity is occurring.
So a lot of people talk about cyber criminals, and I asked in the audience, what's the cyber criminal look like? And everyone has this picture of someone in a dark room with a hoodie on, sitting on a laptop on a keypad. Now, they probably actually employ those people, but these are very elaborate businesses. These are big companies. There's not someone sitting on the kitchen table or in the garage.
They've got customer care teams.
Exactly. To actually work out how to penetrate big corporations and all sorts of business. I haven't got the stats, but if, for example, they were targeting 100 businesses a day and trying to attack them, they are now so sophisticated, they're now using AI. So instead of doing 100 a day, they'll start doing 100,000 a day. This is going to go through the roof. And I keep banging on about this, and I'm not an IT expert, but I can see the writing on the wall. Every business is going to get hacked or get an attempted hack on them, and they might get through. So you might be the local fish and chip shop. I get into you and I go, well, we don't really care. Or, you know what, we'll pay the couple of $1,000s. Good, there's a couple of grand there. They might hit a Coles or a big bank, and they'll get tens of millions of dollars out of them potentially. But the fact is, they're going to be hitting every single business. And one message I really want to drill home, don't think you're going to fly under the radar or it may not happen. Just work on premise. It's going to happen, and we need to be really robust and prepared for it. It's like going to war. You know, we're all in our positions like a military unit, and as soon as that comes over the horizon there, we're ready, because the AI is going to accelerate that. These people are sophisticated. They've been smart enough to crack into Optus, into Latitude. Even as we speak now, to be companies getting hacked, it's escalating at a phenomenal rate. I've got some stats here, but it's frightening. So businesses just have to say this. It's going to happen. Let's be prepared.
Nobody is too small.
No one's too small. Exactly. No one's too small or too big.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about that. They're probably also able to hack into the insurer's system and see who's got the insurance, and then go, okay, well, they've got a good policy. Let's go after them. Anyway, on that very uplifting note, we're getting towards the end of the podcast, and so we always finish off the same way, and I'll ask Rob. I'll ask you to answer this question first, and then I'll throw to Allan. So, if you were the Prime Minister of Australia for the day, what law would you change? And it doesn't have to be in this spectrum. It could be anything. It could be, public holiday trading, whatever you think.
Matilda's public holiday.
Matilda's public holiday. That's a topical.
Nearly got there.
Nearly got there.
It is a tough one. You've caught me off guard on that one. But I think I'd change the date of Australia Day, and I'd make it the 1st of September, which is actually Wattle Day.
Okay.
As a better symbol of inclusion that every Australian could rally around and not have a divisive debate in the community about what's the best day. It's certainly not Invasion Day.
Yeah, I'll right there with you on that one.
Yep.
You, Allan?
Well, mine would be, and this is a business lens, actually more a community lens as well. I would make integrity a subject in everything from primary school, secondary school, university, and in business. Because sadly, I look around now on a local, a state, a federal, and an international level, we've really lost that.
Yeah.
And people often say, what's integrity? And my interpretation of integrity is what you do when no one's watching.
Yeah.
And to expand that a little bit, I think there's 3 critical things, and this goes back to critical incident management. If you have trust, integrity, and hope, it doesn't almost matter what you've done, people will stay with you. They go, I trust you, you've got integrity, and you've given me hope, I'll stay with you.
Yeah.
So businesses are going to go get, and I keep saying to all my clients, get those 3 pillars right, no matter what critical incident you have, we'll get through it.
Yeah. I think it's a great message to finish off on. So thank you, Allan, and thank you, Robert. That was terrific. Thanks for your time today. Thank you for tuning in to Legally Consumed, a consumer products podcast by the Consumer Products Law Firm. This was presented by Raf Goldenberg, Kay Ho, and Will McMinn from CIE Legal. Our theme song is by our very own CIE Legal house band, which is comprised of Will McMinn, Andrew Marr, and Andrew Thompson.
This podcast production is in partnership with Social Star.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please make sure you follow us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts from. For more updates and behind-the-scenes footage, head to our Instagram at CIE Legal, all one word. You can also check out our website to listen to a range of episodes and find additional free information at www.cielegal.com.au. To get in contact with CIE Legal about consumer products legal services, reach out to us on info@cielegal.com.au. Thanks again for listening to Legally Consumed, and see you all in the next episode.